bustling corridors of St. Gabriel's Academy in New Orleans pulsed with first-day energy as students navigated their way through the historic building. The school's reputation for academic excellence was matched only by its strict adherence to traditional values, evident in the sea of perfectly pressed uniforms and regulation haircuts. In Ms. Karen Mitchell's art classroom, 14-year-old Jamal Thompson stood out immediately, not just because of his natural talent. His charcoal sketch of the French Quarter had already caught the teacher's attention, but because of his meticulously maintained dreadlocks, each one carefully groomed and tied back neatly with a band that matched his school uniform. Jamal's artistic ability wasn't just raw talent. It was the result of countless hours spent with his mother, Sarah, who ran a small gallery in the Marigny neighborhood. Every weekend they would sit together, sketching the vibrant life of New Orleans, while she shared stories of their family's rich cultural heritage. His dreadlocks were more than just a hairstyle. They were a connection to that heritage, carefully maintained since he was 10 years old. During the third period, Karen stood at the front of the classroom, her spine rigid as a ruler. "At St. Gabriel's, we pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards," she announced, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Jamal. "Our code of conduct ensures that everyone fits the professional image we've cultivated for over 50 years. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jamal continued working on his artwork, trying to ignore the weight of her stare. The scratch of his pencil against paper was the only sound in the room. Karen walked between the desks, her heels clicking against the floor. She stopped beside Jamal's desk, picked up his latest sketch, a stunning representation of a jazz musician, and set it down without comment. From her desk drawer, she retrieved a pair of scissors. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "your hair violates our grooming standards. This has gone on long enough." Without warning, she grabbed one of his dreadlocks and began cutting. The classroom erupted in gasps. Several students pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Jamal sat frozen, watching pieces of his hair fall to the floor. The scissors made a harsh sound as they sliced through years of growth, years of cultural pride, years of connection to his heritage. When she finished, Jamal's hair was uneven, some dreadlocks cut at different lengths, others still intact. The bell rang, but no one moved. Karen returned to her desk as if nothing unusual had happened, while Jamal stared at the scattered pieces of his dreadlocks on the floor. Finally, Marcus, Jamal's best friend, stood up. "This isn't right," he said, his voice shaking. Other students began to murmur in agreement, but Karen simply wrote up a detention slip and placed it on Jamal's desk. "Clean this up before you leave," she instructed, pointing to the hair on the floor. "And make sure you get a proper haircut before returning to school tomorrow." The classroom slowly emptied, students casting backward glances at Jamal, who remained seated, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. His artwork lay forgotten, the jazz musician's face now seeming to reflect his own pain and humiliation. The walk home from school felt endless. Jamal clutched his backpack straps, head down, avoiding the stares of passers-by. Videos of the incident had already started circulating on social media. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. Sarah Thompson was arranging a new exhibition when Jamal burst through the gallery door. One look at her son's mutilated hair, and the frame she was holding crashed to the floor. "Baby, what happened?" she whispered, rushing to him. Jamal collapsed into his mother's arms, finally letting the tears flow. Between sobs, he recounted the incident. Sarah's face hardened with each detail. She touched the jagged ends of his remaining dreadlocks, locks she had helped him maintain since he first asked to grow them in honor of his grandfather. "This isn't just about hair," she said, her voice trembling with controlled anger. "This is about dignity, about respect." That evening, Sarah's phone started ringing. Marcus's mother called first, then the parents of 3 other students who had witnessed the incident. One of the videos had gone viral, reaching local community leaders and civil rights organizations. By nightfall, their small living room was filled with concerned parents, all sharing similar stories of discrimination at St. Gabriel's. "My daughter was told her braids were unprofessional last semester," one mother revealed. Another parent spoke about his son being pressured to change his name to something easier to pronounce. Each story fueled the growing outrage. Reverend James Wallace, a respected community leader, arrived unannounced. "This isn't an isolated incident," he declared, pacing the cramped space. "This is a pattern, and it stops now." He pulled out his phone, showing emails from other families who had experienced similar treatment, but had been afraid to speak up. Sarah organized the growing group into action teams. Some parents started documenting past incidents, others began drafting formal complaints, and a few with legal backgrounds researched relevant precedents. The living room transformed into a command center for what was becoming a movement. Meanwhile, Jamal sat at his desk, trying to sketch, but finding his usually steady hand shaking. His phone continued buzzing, this time with supportive messages from students planning to wear head wraps and cultural hairstyles in solidarity the next day. By midnight, "On Justice for Jamal" was trending locally on social media. News stations had picked up the story, and reporters were requesting interviews. Sarah fielded calls while helping Jamal process the day's events. "Mom," Jamal said quietly as she tucked him in, something she hadn't done since he was small. "I don't want to go back tomorrow." Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, taking his hand. "You're going back," she said firmly, "but not alone. Never alone again." The next morning, a crowd had gathered outside St. Gabriel's Academy. Parents, students, and community members held signs reading, "Our culture is not a violation," and "Diversity is our strength." Local news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing the growing protest. In her spacious office overlooking the school courtyard, Michelle Carter watched the growing protest through floor-to-ceiling windows. As owner and principal of St. Gabriel's Academy, she had spent years building its reputation for excellence. Now, her phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from board members, donors, and angry parents. "This isn't what we stand for," she muttered, reviewing the viral video for the 10th time. The sight of Karen Mitchell cutting Jamal's hair made her stomach turn. What the protesters outside didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Karen wasn't just any teacher. She was Michelle's niece. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Carter, Jamal Thompson and his mother are here," her assistant announced. Michelle straightened her suit jacket, trying to compose herself. She had specifically requested this meeting, hoping to address the situation before it spiraled further out of control. Sarah Thompson entered first, her head held high, followed by Jamal, who seemed smaller than his 14 years. Michelle gestured for them to sit, noting how Sarah positioned herself protectively between her son and the desk. "First, I want to express my deepest apologies," Michelle began, but Sarah cut her off. "Apologies won't grow back my son's hair," she said firmly. "Or restore his dignity." Michelle nodded, feeling the weight of every word. She opened a folder on her desk, revealing documentation of Karen's previous incidents, complaints that had been quietly handled, warnings that had been issued but never escalated. "There's something you need to know," Michelle said slowly, "something that complicates this situation." She explained her relationship to Karen, watching Sarah's expression shift from surprise to anger. "So that's why she's still teaching here? Family loyalty?" Sarah demanded. "No," Michelle replied, her voice cracking slightly. "She's here because I thought I could help her change. I thought if I guided her, mentored her." She trailed off, realizing how hollow the words sounded. Jamal, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Did you know she was going to cut my hair?" Michelle's eyes filled with tears. "No, Jamal, if I had known." She pulled out another document, Karen's teaching contract. Family or not, what she did was assault. It was discriminatory. It was wrong. Sarah leaned forward. What are you going to do about it? Before Michelle could answer, shouting erupted from the courtyard. They all turned to look out the window. Karen had arrived at school, pushing through the protesters, her face set in defiance. I need to handle this, Michelle said, standing. But I want you both to know, Karen's actions do not reflect the values I want this school to represent. I failed you by not addressing her behavior sooner. That changes today. As they watched Karen enter the building, Michelle picked up her phone. Cancel my meetings and call the board. We're having an emergency session. She turned to Sarah and Jamal. Would you be willing to speak to them? They need to hear your story directly. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah and Jamal exchanged glances. Outside, the chants grew louder and more news vans pulled up to the school. The school courtyard, typically reserved for lunch breaks and quiet study sessions, transformed into a sea of solidarity. Students arrived wearing traditional head wraps, braids, dreadlocks, and natural hairstyles. Those who couldn't change their hair carried signs and wore t-shirts with messages of support. Marcus had organized a student committee overnight, coordinating with social media activists to ensure their message stayed focused and peaceful. This isn't just about one incident, he announced through a borrowed megaphone. This is about every student who's ever been made to feel ashamed of their identity. The protest grew as community members joined throughout the morning. Local artists set up easels, creating portraits of students with their natural hair. Musicians from the French Quarter brought their instruments, filling the air with jazz rhythms that gave the gathering the feel of a cultural celebration rather than just a protest. Jamal emerged from the main building after his meeting with Michelle. The crowd parted as he walked down the steps, and for a moment, he froze, overwhelmed by the support. Sarah squeezed his hand, encouraging him forward. Taking the megaphone with trembling hands, Jamal faced his peers. Yesterday, I felt alone, he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. Today, I look around and see that I never was. We all have stories. We all have culture. We all have value. The crowd erupted in cheers. Students began sharing their own experiences of discrimination, turning the protest into an impromptu speak-out. A girl described being told her box braids were distracting. A boy talked about having to use an anglicized version of his name. From her classroom window, Karen watched the scene unfold. She had arrived early, avoiding the main entrance, but couldn't escape the sound of testimonies echoing through the building. Her usual composure cracked as she recognized more and more of her former students among the speakers. The local news crews captured everything, broadcasting live as the demonstration grew. Parents who had initially hesitated to get involved began arriving, many taking personal days from work to stand with their children. The hashtag #YesJusticeForJamal evolved into Our Culture Matters, trending nationwide. Michelle stepped out onto the school steps, flanked by board members who had rushed to campus for the emergency meeting. The crowd quieted, anticipating an announcement. Instead, Michelle walked down to join the protesters, removing her suit jacket and revealing a t-shirt that read, "Change starts here." Today's classes, she announced, her voice carrying across the courtyard, will be about listening and learning. Every student who wishes to speak will be heard. Every story matters. The demonstration shifted into an organized forum. Students set up a podium, creating a space where anyone could share their experiences. Teachers who supported the movement began bringing out chairs, transforming the protest into an outdoor assembly. Karen remained in her classroom, alone, watching as her carefully maintained system of control crumbled outside her window. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michelle. "Board meeting, 3 p.m. Your presence is required." The boardroom, with its dark wood panels and portraits of past principals, felt suffocating as board members filed in at 3 p.m. sharp. Michelle sat at the head of the table, a stack of documents in front of her. Karen entered last, choosing a seat near the door, her usual confidence noticeably shaken. This emergency session of the St. Gabriel's Academy Board of Directors will now come to order, Michelle announced, her voice steady despite the tension. We're here to address yesterday's incident and its broader implications for our institution. The board members, a mix of educational veterans and community leaders, reviewed the viral video in silence. Several winced visibly at the footage. Karen stared at her hands, avoiding the screen. Before we proceed, Michelle continued, I need to disclose something that may affect this deliberation. Karen Mitchell is my niece. Murmurs filled the room. This relationship has potentially clouded my judgment in previous situations involving Ms. Mitchell's conduct. She distributed folders containing documented complaints against Karen, incidents that had been reported but minimized over the years. Parents claiming their children were singled out, students requesting transfers from her class, letters from concerned teachers. Why are we just seeing these now? Demanded Dr. Rodriguez, a longtime board member. This pattern of behavior should have been addressed years ago. Karen finally spoke up. These complaints are exaggerated. I've maintained high standards for all students, regardless of background. The school dress code. The dress code was never meant to be a weapon, interrupted Mrs. Washington, another board member. It was never meant to strip students of their identity. The door opened, and Sarah Thompson entered with Jamal. The board had requested their testimony. Jamal's partially cut dreadlocks stood as stark evidence of the previous day's events. He spoke first, his voice clear despite his nervousness. Before yesterday, I loved coming to school, he said. I was proud of my art, proud of my grades, proud of who I am. Ms. Mitchell didn't just cut my hair, she tried to cut away part of who I am. Sarah followed with a powerful statement about cultural identity and educational responsibility. She presented letters from other parents, testimonies from students, and statistics about the impact of discriminatory policies on student performance. Karen attempted to defend herself. I was enforcing school policy. No, Michelle cut in sharply. You were enforcing your own prejudices. The policy never authorized physical assault on a student. The board deliberated for hours. They reviewed school policies, teacher contracts, and state regulations. They discussed the protests outside and the media attention growing by the minute. Finally, they reached a decision. Michelle stood to deliver it. Karen Mitchell, your actions constitute a gross violation of professional ethics and student rights. Your employment at St. Gabriel's Academy is terminated, effective immediately. Karen's face drained of color. You can't. I'm family. That's precisely why I should have done this sooner, Michelle replied. Please clear out your classroom by tomorrow. As Karen left the room, the board turned to their next task, rewriting school policies to explicitly protect cultural expression and student dignity. The following Monday, St. Gabriel's Academy felt like a different school. The main hallway, previously lined with traditional portraits, now displayed student artwork celebrating diverse cultural expressions. Michelle had worked through the weekend with a committee of parents, teachers, and students to implement immediate changes. The morning assembly buzzed with nervous excitement as Michelle took the podium. Today marks a new chapter in our school's history, she began. We're introducing the Cultural Expression Initiative, a complete overhaul of our policies and curriculum. She outlined the changes, a revised dress code that explicitly protected cultural hairstyles and religious dress, mandatory cultural competency training for staff, and a new student-led diversity council. Most significantly, the art program would be expanded, with a focus on multicultural perspectives and expressions. Jamal, now sporting a professionally maintained shorter hairstyle of his choice, sat in the front row. His mother had helped him process the trauma of the incident, and he'd chosen to become part of the solution. As the newly elected head of the Student Diversity Council, he would have a direct line to the administration. "Our first project," Michelle announced, "will be a school-wide art exhibition titled Our Stories, Our Strength. We're transforming the main gymnasium into a gallery space for students to share their cultural narratives through various art forms." The teachers embraced the changes with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some, like Mr. Rodriguez from the history department, immediately revised their lesson plans to include more diverse perspectives. Others required gentle guidance and support from Michelle and the newly appointed cultural competency coordinator. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some traditional donors threatened to withdraw their support, and a few families transferred their children to other schools. But for every loss, there seemed to be a gain. New donors stepped forward, impressed by the school's commitment to change. Applications from diverse families increased. In art class, now led by a new teacher, Ms. Jackson, Jamal found himself helping other students express their stories through art. His own piece for the exhibition, a powerful self-portrait showing his transformation, became a symbol of the school's journey. Sarah Thompson, seeing the positive changes, agreed to join the school's advisory board. Her gallery experience proved invaluable in organizing the upcoming exhibition. She worked closely with students, helping them frame their artistic statements and present their work professionally. During lunch breaks, the courtyard became a space for cultural exchange. Students shared traditional foods, taught each other phrases in different languages, and practiced various art forms. The rigid silence that had once characterized St. Gabriel's was replaced by vibrant discussions and occasional bursts of music. Michelle often watched these interactions from her office window, noting how naturally the students adapted to the new environment. The fear of losing the school's prestigious reputation had been replaced by pride in creating a more inclusive definition of excellence. 3 months after her dismissal, Karen Mitchell appeared at the school gates during dismissal time. She looked different, humbled, with a letter of apology in her hand and claims of having undergone cultural sensitivity training. The security guard, following new protocols, immediately notified Michelle. "I've changed," Karen insisted when Michelle met her in the visitors area. "I've spent these months reflecting, learning. I've realized my mistakes." She pulled out certificates from diversity workshops and testimonials from community service at cultural centers. News of her presence spread quickly through the school. Students gathered in the hallways, whispering and texting. Jamal, in the middle of hanging artwork for the upcoming exhibition, froze when he heard. The memory of that day still felt fresh. "I understand if you don't want to rehire me," Karen continued, her voice softer than anyone remembered. "But I'd like to at least apologize to Jamal and the other students I've hurt. Perhaps I could speak at an assembly about what I've learned." Michelle studied her niece, noting the genuine remorse in her voice, but also remembering the years of ignored warnings. "The students aren't guinea pigs for your redemption journey," she replied firmly. "They're not here to help you feel better about your actions." Word reached Sarah Thompson, who immediately drove to the school. She found Karen in the parking lot, still trying to convince Michelle to let her address the students. "You don't get to decide when people are ready to hear your apology," Sarah stated, standing between Karen and the school entrance. Students began emerging from the building, many wearing traditional hairstyles and cultural accessories that would have earned them detention under Karen's old rules. They stared at their former teacher, some with fear, others with anger, but most with a new confidence that showed they no longer feared her judgment. Karen watched as Jamal walked out, surrounded by friends, his new artwork carried carefully under his arm. She stepped forward to speak to him, but several students moved protectively closer to him. The message was clear. He was no longer alone. "Ms. Mitchell," Jamal said, his voice steady, "we're preparing for our cultural art exhibition next week. Every piece tells a story of identity and growth. Your actions became part of my story, but they don't define it. We've moved forward. Maybe you should too. The Student Diversity Council convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. They drafted a formal statement opposing Karen's return in any capacity. Her presence would re-traumatize students who are just beginning to feel safe expressing themselves, the statement read. Michelle received the statement along with hundreds of emails from parents and community members. Many acknowledged the possibility of redemption, but agreed that St. Gabriel's could not be the place for Karen's journey of transformation. As the sun set, Karen finally left the campus, her apology letter undelivered. She watched students leaving after-school activities, their conversations filled with excitement about the upcoming exhibition rather than fear about dress code violations. A week later, during the final preparations for the cultural art exhibition, Karen returned, this time with a lawyer. They strode into the main hall where students were hanging artwork, causing an immediate hush to fall over the space. Her attorney carried a thick folder of documents, claiming discrimination and wrongful termination. "You can't just erase 20 years of service," Karen announced loudly, her earlier humility replaced with defensive anger. "This whole cultural revolution is destroying the standards that made this school great." Students quickly pulled out their phones, the scene feeling eerily familiar. Michelle arrived quickly, positioning herself between Karen and the students. "Take this to my office," she said firmly, but Karen refused to move. Her eyes were fixed on the walls, now covered in artwork celebrating various cultural identities and experiences. "Look at what you've done to this place," Karen continued, her voice rising. "No discipline, no standards, just chaos disguised as diversity." She pointed to a powerful piece, Jamal's self-portrait showing his transformation after the incident. Jamal, who had been helping younger students arrange their artwork, stepped forward. 3 months of leading the Diversity Council had given him a confidence that surprised even him. "Would you like me to explain my piece, Miss Mitchell?" he asked calmly. The hallway fell silent. Karen seemed taken aback by his composure. "I documented every stage," Jamal continued, walking toward his artwork. "The fear when you picked up those scissors, the shame walking home, the anger seeing my culture treated like a violation." Other students began moving forward, standing beside their own pieces. Marcus pointed to his photograph series showing students' traditional hairstyles. "This is what real standards look like," he said. "Excellence doesn't mean erasing who we are." Karen's lawyer tried to intervene, but students kept stepping forward, each describing their artwork and the story behind it. Sarah Thompson, there to help with the exhibition, watched proudly as her son and his peers stood their ground without raising their voices or showing fear. "You want to talk about standards?" Michelle interrupted. "Look around. Our test scores are up. Attendance has improved. College acceptance letters are rolling in. These students aren't succeeding despite their culture. They're succeeding because they're finally free to embrace it." Karen's composure cracked. "This isn't what I gave 20 years of my life for," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't education. It's pandemonium." "No," Jamal replied quietly. "This is growth, and you gave us the push we needed to make it happen." He gestured to his self-portrait. "I added something to the piece yesterday. Look closely." In the corner of his artwork, barely noticeable, was a small figure with scissors. Not as a villain, but as a catalyst for change. "You're part of our story," Jamal explained, "but not in the way you intended." The next morning, Karen's legal challenge hit the local news. Her lawyer had filed a lawsuit claiming reverse discrimination and hostile work environment, demanding not just reinstatement, but also control over the school's new cultural policies. The timing, one day before the exhibition opening, seemed deliberately calculated to cause maximum disruption. Michelle called an emergency meeting with the school's legal team, while protesters from both sides gathered outside. A small but vocal group of traditionalists supported Karen, carrying signs reading, "Bring back standards" and "Merit over politics." They clashed verbally with the much larger group of students, parents, and community members defending the new policies. Inside, the exhibition preparation continued. Students worked with double determination, their art becoming both shield and sword in this final battle. Jamal and the Diversity Council transformed the conflict into part of the exhibition itself, creating a wall dedicated to the school's transformation titled "The Price of Change." Karen's lawyer demanded a court injunction to stop the exhibition, claiming it promoted an anti-traditional agenda. When that failed, Karen attempted a different approach. She began contacting past students who had transferred due to the new policies, gathering testimonies about the school's declining standards. Michelle, however, was prepared. She presented the board with comprehensive data, improved attendance rates, higher test scores, increased parent involvement, and most significantly, a surge in student achievements in competitions and college admissions. "Our standards haven't declined," she declared. "They've evolved to embrace excellence in all its forms." The confrontation reached its peak when Karen and her supporters attempted to enter the exhibition space during final preparations. She carried a thick portfolio of what she called traditional student achievements, test scores, and awards from her tenure. But as she tried to force her way past security, she faced an unexpected obstacle: her own former students. A line of students, led by those who had suffered under her rigid policies, blocked the entrance. They didn't shout or argue. Instead, they began sharing their stories, one after another, their voices calm but unwavering. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a powerful narrative of survival and transformation. Sarah Thompson, watching from beside Jamal, suddenly stepped forward. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "you're fighting so hard to preserve what you built that you can't see what you actually created. Look around. These students learned resilience from your rigidity. They found strength in their resistance to your rules. You wanted to teach them standards? They've created better ones." The local media captured everything. Karen's attempts to portray herself as a victim of cultural change backfired as more stories emerged. Her lawyer, sensing the shifting public opinion, began suggesting an out-of-court settlement. Michelle seized the moment. She offered Karen a choice: withdraw the lawsuit and acknowledge the harm she had caused, or face a countersuit with hundreds of student testimonies. "You taught them to stand up for what they believe in," Michelle reminded her. "They learned that lesson well." On the evening of the exhibition opening, as hundreds of community members filled the transformed gymnasium, security cameras caught Karen slipping into the school through a rarely used side entrance. She carried a large bag, and her movements were furtive. But she wasn't alone. Michelle had been watching her niece's car from her office window, anticipating one final, desperate move. What no one expected was what the bag contained: years of hidden documentation, grade alterations for preferred students, correspondence with wealthy parents promising special treatment, evidence that Karen had been running a shadow system of favoritism beneath her facade of strict standards. Michelle intercepted Karen in the hallway leading to the exhibition. "I found everything while cleaning out my apartment," Karen said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending. The standards I claim to uphold, they were never real. They were just a way to maintain control, to keep certain students in and others out." The revelation stunned the board members who had gathered for the exhibition opening. Karen's crusade for traditional standards crumbled as she revealed how she had selectively enforced rules, favoring students from privileged backgrounds while finding ways to push others out. Jamal, who had been making final adjustments to his exhibition piece, overheard the confession. His self-portrait, showing his journey from victim to leader, now seemed to tell an even deeper story. It wasn't just about his hair or his culture. It was about exposing a system of invisible barriers disguised as standards. As Karen's full confession emerged, several former students came forward with their own stories. Athletes who mysteriously lost scholarships after challenging her. Talented artists whose work was never selected for display. Students who were told they weren't Saint Gabriel's material, despite their abilities. The exhibition opening transformed into something unexpected, a moment of collective healing. Karen's presence, intended to disrupt, instead provided closure. Students whose talents had been dismissed under her regime now stood proudly beside their artwork, their achievements impossible to deny. Michelle, standing at the podium to officially open the exhibition, made an unprecedented decision. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating art or culture," she announced. "We're celebrating truth. The truth that excellence comes in many forms. The truth that real standards lift people up instead of shutting them out." Karen, her attempts at sabotage transformed into unintended redemption, watched as students. She had tried to marginalize received recognition for their talents. Her carefully maintained system of control had not just been dismantled, it had been transformed into a testament to resilience and authenticity. The evening ended with Jamal unveiling his final piece, a collaborative mural created with other students, showing the school's transformation. In one corner, barely visible but intentionally present, was a small pair of scissors, now transformed into a symbol not of destruction, but of liberation. As the community celebrated, Michelle found a note from Karen on her desk. "I finally understand," it read. "The standards I fought so hard to protect were the very things holding our students back. Their excellence was always there. I just refused to see it in any form but my own." The story of Saint. The story, Gabriel's Academy, became a case study in educational transformation, proving that true excellence emerges not from rigid conformity, but from creating space for every student to thrive in their own authentic way.